Alright, welcome back. In this next portion of class, we're going to be kind of looking, as we said, at the concept of language development. So how our language abilities actually grow over time. And we're going to do this by focusing in on three aspects of language development. The first aspect we're going to look at, and one that parents are usually much more focused on, is this concept of milestones in language development that we actually experience. So when do we pick up on these kind of ideas and these rules that we talked about earlier? The next portion of this class is going to focus in on challenges that we see in language development during different ages. So not only when we do things, but what we're struggling with at different ages throughout our life. And then the last thing we're going to look at is kind of major trends in language developments over the lifespan. So how our language skills either grow or decline or alter in specific ways, both due to culture and age-related growth. When we're starting with this concept of language, even though language certainly isn't very diverse at this particular age, what most language psychologists start with is this concept of infants communication. And when we look at infant communication, there's obviously not a lot of things that a child says, but it still has a very, very adept way of communicating with us in what most psychologists believe is a very basic reflex, just like the other reflexes that we've talked about. And this basic reflex comes in two forms. The first form all of us are probably familiar with, and that's crying. Crying is a very early vocalization that's absolutely essential for us. It's our very first communication tool we have. And crying is meant to display displeasure, so unhappiness. Now, displeasure can come in a number of different forms, and we're going to talk about some different types of cry that relate to different types of displeasure that we've sort of picked up on in studies. But the idea behind crying is always the same. If something's bothering us or something's upsetting us, usually we have a tendency to cry. And this is a natural reaction at birth. We believe it's a reflex, and very often it carries over into adulthood as well. But in addition to being able to cry, babies, infants, very quickly develop other types of communication as well. In fact, within 2 months, most of us start to display a verbal way of communicating not only displeasure, but also pleasure. And that's something that we call cooing. It's kind of a, well, if you've ever heard a dove coo, if you don't know what a child's cooing sounds like, it's kind of a close example. So it's kind of this output of air, this kind of excited output of air that children do when they're happy. And it's meant, in theory, to display that they like whatever is actually being presented to them. And for the very first couple months of life, children pretty much are just communicating with these two tools, crying or cooing, and both of them are just asking for people to either approach with something or go away with it. And most of the time, that's all children and infants really need to be able to communicate with for a long period of time. But as they become more dynamic, as they kind of grow and their needs start to vary, kids have to start finding ways to actually communicate in more effective manners. And this typically entices kids to start trying to communicate in another way. And when we see child communication, we often see as their next big move is to start trying to figure out ways to actually produce sounds that mean something. And this causes children to move on to the next type of vocalization called babbling, where they start kind of practicing with communication by just shouting out or kind of gargling out different strings of consonants. And we believe, most developmental psychologists believe, that this is probably their early attempts and reactions to their environment to kind of communicate more diverse ideas. So practice using the language that they're seeing every single day in their environment. As we move on and grow in development, what we usually see is kind of a growth in our ability to pick up on very specific sounds within our language. And those abilities to pick up on specific sounds within our language and within other languages even at a short time is something that children seem to be almost adept at doing. And a lot of researchers believe, in fact, that young infants, so somewhere around birth to about 6 months of age, actually have better vocabulary capability and better ears with respect to different sounds in language than any adult. And that's because some researchers propose some researchers propose, that children are what we call citizens of the world. Now, this means that children not only can pick up on their own sounds, so their own phonemes that are very important, but they can also pick up on phonemes of other languages as well. It's as if their ears haven't adapted to their specific language. And because of this kind of astute observation and picking up of sounds, a lot of researchers believe that children at this particular age should be exposed to a lot of languages. So up to about 6 months of age, there's an insistence by a lot of developmental psychologists that if we know people who speak other languages, or we know of videos or movies where different languages are present, these children should be exposed to these languages, because if they are exposed to them at a young age, a number of studies have shown that they might be more receptive to those particular sounds as they get older. But if they're not exposed to these languages, if they're not exposed to those phonemes, they start to kind of block them out. They start to perceive those phonemes as ones that aren't important. So we talked about it earlier with the cat and the cat. Those two very similar words, you kind of ignored that change in inflection between the two A's. And that change in inflection is something that children are initially attentive to. Only after they've experienced a specific language and been rewarded and kind of not rewarded for picking up on specific sounds do children start to really attune to specific types of sounds. And even though we might not think of this as being important, this first step is really critical. And what I thought you could do just to see how important it is kind of watch a video of another language with different phonemes to understand how difficult not knowing the phonemes of a specific language actually are. So if you click on that particular link or connect to this link here, what I'd like you to do is watch the little music video and try to identify the pauses in the song that you're watching. And what you'll see once they get into the song is, even though you know the song, most of you at least should know the song, it's really impossible to figure out where each word actually is. And a major portion of that, a major problem with that, is that we don't know the phonemes that are important. And if we don't know the phonemes that are important and we don't know the structure of the words, then picking up on those pauses becomes much, much more difficult. Okay? After children start to recognize language sounds, they get into 6 months and they start focusing in on their specific language, the next big milestone they go through is something called gesturing. And it's the first transition out of verbal communication and into other forms of communication. So basic gesturing for young children at this age usually involves pointing to things or looking to things or grabbing at things. And these gesturing communication skills only get greater with age. And it's another big pattern and growth that we see within children. It's really critical for them to not only master physical communication, but when they start to pick up on language and they start to focus on things, they can become even better at communication through kind of mastering this particular process of gesturing. One of the last things that they are able to develop, and we talked about this earlier, with respect to language development is gaze following. So at 11 months, they also pick up on the ability to understand what somebody's looking at, what somebody's focusing on. And when they do that, they quickly acquire the ability to pick up on the meaning of words, what sounds are actually appropriate for identifying an object or an idea, and they can very quickly transition that into understanding spoken language or even producing their own language within a short period of time. After a while, after kind of picking up on language and understanding things, kids meet the very first big milestone that parents actually care about. And that's the first word. Now, the first word typically occurs between 10 and 15 months of age. There's some exceptions to that. Some kids might speak their first word at 9 months. Some kids might not speak their first word until about 18 months. But for the most part, a large majority of the population speaks their first word between 10 and 15 months of age. And for most of us, that first word is fairly simple. It's whatever our mouth can actually produce as a sound. And in fact, a number of studies have shown that our first words very likely are probably just due to random chance. What these studies also showed, though, is unfortunately, despite the fact that parents are extremely excited about their first word of their child, this first word really is just a minimal step in the language growth process. And by the time a child first speaks its first word, it already understands a large, complex system of sounds, and it can probably pick up on a number of very specific words. It also typically can gesture very, very effectively what it actually wants or what it's trying to avoid. And it can pick up on a number of different ideas and things that are being communicated to the child long before that first word actually comes out. And in fact, that production of the first word is really just a small transition from that babbling that we see into a random combination of sounds that we recognize as a word. And after that first word is spoken, then typically what we do is dramatically increase from that first word to a large number of words later. And that's because not only do children have the spoken vocabulary, words that they're using at this stage, but they are very receptive to other words as well. So they know a lot more words than they're capable of speaking. So at this particular stage, around 1 year of age, kids know, almost 50, 60, 100 words already before they speak their first word. So once they start to master the ability to use their mouth, that vocabulary spurt starts to come up. And that vocabulary spurt of growth usually happens around 3 to 5 months after that first word is spoken. The thing that seems to trigger the vocabulary spurt, though, is more of a physical growth of communication skills. And that physical growth requires a little bit of time. So when a child speaks its first word, most of the time just gets lucky in its babbling, parents start to expect a child to just flow words out of their mouth. But some development has to take place. So you'll hear them say one word, and then, a couple weeks later, maybe say another word, and a couple weeks later, develop a third word. And it's a slow, gradual process of kind of growing in vocabulary. They don't say 2 or 3 words in a row in strings yet, but they're just kind of adding to what they're capable of saying, even though they know and can identify a lot more words than that. By the time we reach about 2 years of age, some of us, it might happen about 1.5 years of age, kids move on to be able to actually not only use one word from their vocabulary, but combine 2 words together in order to make very brief utterances. So, my ball, or no go, or anything like that, usually it can come out of a child's mouth. And this simple combination of words allows a child to be much, much more dynamic in its communication styles. And in fact, even though we might not think of these two-word utterances as amazing as those first words. For a child, it's big. It's very, very big because it gives them a lot more ability to interact with their environment. They're not just receptive anymore, they're engaged in what's going on, and they can control a lot of what's going on in their environment. And once that happens, they quickly start progressing into more and more word utterances after that. So by the time they reach 3 years of age, they've probably already gotten to 5-word utterances and even beyond, because of kind of that transition and that recognition that kind of combining these things allows a child to get so much more across. Now, the big step, though, to kind of accomplish something that makes sense, or to kind of really use these utterances effectively, is for a child to not only pick up on the sounds, the phonemes, but they also need to pick up the semantics of the language. Right? They need to know how to structure things, they need to know how to say things, and when they're supposed to say them. And that's a big step in language, in addition to syntax, that requires a lot more effort on their part. So even though we're focused in on what they're saying, it's how they're saying it and how they're organizing it that's very, very important to young children at this particular stage. As we move on with children, though, especially after about 1.5 to 2 years of age, children start to become kind of word wizards. So actually, at this particular stage, what developmental psychologists actually find is that these children, once they start uttering those first couple of words, not only are learning how to say more things differently, but they're learning words at a ridiculous rate. In fact, they learn somewhere between 10 to 14 words a day for 5 years, mind you. Now, you might be able to learn 10 to 14 words today. You might be able to learn, if you're lucky, 10 to 14 words tomorrow, and maybe 10 to 14 words for a week. But imagine doing this for 5 years. That's what these kids are doing. And they're doing it in order to communicate more effectively, and because there's all of these things in their environments that they have to be able to understand. And to do that requires a lot of effort and learning. In addition to doing that, though, mastering words, kids are also mastering that concept of morphology that we talked about earlier. Learning how to say things, how to understand the rules to written language. So you might have a child tell you that they ate an apple, and you might tell them that's exactly how you're supposed to say it. So then they'll turn to you after having a cookie and they'll say, I ate a cookie. And you have to correct them. You have to say, I ate a cookie, because there's different rules when a or an is followed by another word. And for children, this idea of learning morphology kind of rivals that of word mastery. There's a lot of learning about these rules, and what you can often see within their communication skills is that they, as they're doing this, are picking up on kind of all of the subtle rules and using them across situations until they learn differently. So you might think that past tense and future tense and plural and singular and different word structures kind of requiring things to change might not be on the forefront of children's mind, but when we will listen to the way they communicate, what you can often see is that they're using these rules both correctly and incorrectly very quickly, and they're constantly adjusting their communication to accommodate for some of the different things that they've encountered recently within their environments. When we look at language development, though, just like when we look at things like cognitive skills, one thing that we notice within developmental psychology studies is that the education of the parents and the income of the parents and the teaching that the parents provide children has a big impact on how much we actually grow in language skills during childhood. In fact, when we measure word utterances and when we measure vocabulary size, what we often see is a stark contrast between children who are in low-income situations or low education systems and those that are in high-income/high education systems. In fact, if you look at the charts below, you can see two prime examples of different groups. So groups of children with parents that are considered working professionals or white-collar workers, and children whose parents are both or one is on welfare. And just the amount of language that a child produces and the number of words that a child knows is vastly different, even after about a year and a half of age, when we compare these two groups. And that's not saying that money is what's causing children not to learn things, but the idea is that the lower your income status, the lower your education, the less you're exposing your child to more diverse words. And that less exposure, that kind of infrequent experience of vocabulary, has a dramatic and very quick impact on children's vocabulary skills. And these stark findings have reminded a lot of educational psychologists and people within the field trying to find ways to help those in need, to find ways to kind of improve this performance. And that's caused a lot of communities and a lot of groups to try to develop early education programs for these kids. So products like Head Start or even preschool have all been designed in a way to really focus in on these low-income individuals and these kids that aren't exposed to as much language as others, in order to prevent them from really being at a loss by the time they reach even elementary school. And the results for these particular studies have been mixed, but they've been positive enough for us to really get a sense that exposing a child to vocabulary is much more important than we might have originally thought. After we reach childhood, and we get into kind of our later years of childhood, we begin to develop much more kind of in-depth speech capability. In particular, we develop those pragmatic speech skills that we talked about. So we're learning when to say something, when it's appropriate, how to phrase something. So you don't say, give me that, you say, may I have that. And in other languages, which are much more complex with pragmatics, there's a huge transition from very basic communication skills to much more in-depth communication skills. We also see, though, in addition to this, a huge increase in syntax skills. So even though kids are kind of using shortcuts and learning them, they really get them down packed when they get into their late childhood years. Reading also begins to be something that children are capable of doing. So they're not only able to communicate verbally or with signs, but they're also able to read words and actually understand what's going on. In particular, they start to be able to recognize symbols and recognize that those symbols have a specific sound associated with them. And this idea of pairing symbols with sounds is actually a specific teaching approach that a lot of schools used to adapt, called the phonics approach. So you learn the sound that's associated with it, and you can sound whatever it is out that you were reading in order to understand the word. However, some recent programs, some recent schools have actually tried to revise this approach to reading understanding, and they've actually proposed a new type of approach called the whole language approach, where instead of giving kids phonics to look at, now they're supposed to learn words by recognizing the whole word itself. So instead of recognizing the word, the letters H-O-U-S-E for house, now children are asked to just see that combination of letters and know that it indicates house. Well, either approach seems to allow kids to pick up on reading skills and recognize how spoken language can be paired with written language, but there's still a lot of debate that whole language approach really helps kids learn things as easily as they're supposed to. The whole language approach definitely helps kids pick up on basic words much quicker than the phonics approach does. But when kids get exposed to more diverse words and things that they've never encountered before, a number of studies have shown that the phonics approach might actually be more beneficial for children than the whole language approach. But each person in both camps is very insistent that their particular approach is better. And because of that, there's kind of an inconsistency within our school systems in our attempts to figure out how we can actually best help children really gain a large amount of language ability over these particular stages. As children progress, though, not only do they develop their reading skills, their spoken skills, but they start to actually gain in their late childhood years writing skills as well. So not only can they read written language, but they can actually write written language. But to write written language, children have to develop a number of other skills that don't usually kind of coincide with language abilities. One of the major skills that kids have to develop, one that takes actually a large period of time, is fine motor skills for writing. Now, we talked about fine motor skills way back in motor development. And we talked about those gross motor skills that involve large-scale movement, and fine motor skills which involve movement of very small muscle clusters or even bones within our body. Well, fine motor skills, as we said earlier, take time to develop. And when we look at writing of young children, we can appreciate that necessity for the time to develop. So if you see a 3 or 4-year-old and they're writing their first letters ever, what you're going to see is some very interesting assemblances of different symbols and combinations of moves and motions within their hands that we don't see typically in most writing. Well, as we age, as we progress, in particular if we practice writing over and over, our fine motor skills improve, and our writing becomes much better as we age. That doesn't mean that kids aren't trying to write when it comes to around 5 or 6 years of age. And it doesn't mean that they don't know how to write. It's just that they have to develop the skills to be able to write effectively. And that's because not only does writing involve just fine motor skill development, but it requires them to actually have mastered those reading skills. So they have to know what the appropriate symbols are to write something, and more importantly, they have to know how to present those symbols in the right format. And that recognition of presenting symbols in the right formats, the right order, combining syntax, and all of the kind of collections of ideas that are required to write something out effectively, is something that young kids really struggle with. In fact, what's even more interesting is the fact this is another thing that not only do kids struggle with, but teenagers and a lot of the time even adults struggle with. Learning how to write effectively, unfortunately, doesn't just require good motor skills. It doesn't require just knowing the words for things. It requires knowing how to follow the rules of writing when you're displaying something. Because even though we might speak very eloquently, when we try to put something down on paper, or even if we read things very easily, when we try to write it out, right, that writing process can sometimes be riddled with errors and mistakes because we don't have to usually think about the syntax of things, or we don't have to think about things like coherence when we're writing, or I guess when we're speaking or reading pieces of information. But when we're writing, syntax and coherence is absolutely essential. As we progress, though, in addition to kind of growing in our ability to write, growing in our ability to read, when we move into early adolescence and kind of progress throughout adolescence, The main language growth that we see is increases in vocabulary, so the number of words that we use, and increases in our ability to use pragmatics effectively. So young kids can sort of understand the difference between may I and give me this, but as we age, we start to become more and more capable of defining different ways to communicate within different situations. So for adolescents, instead of just learning to say may I to everybody, adolescents learn who to speak to in specific ways. So they might have one group of friends where they have a very specific set list of words and ways of communicating that they actually use. And they might hang with another group of friends where they completely alter their communication style. And then they might go home and speak with their parents in a very different way. And they might go to work and speak in a very different manner. And that all speaks to their growth in pragmatic skills. And what's even more interesting with adolescents, and sometimes much more annoying to people talking to adolescents, is that they also develop not only pragmatics, but they learn kind of the tricks of language skills, in particular the language that they use most often. And one of the big annoyances with this playing of language skills is the development of sarcasm. Teens are very adept at sarcasm, as most of you probably know, and they're also very adept at kind of belittling and derision in their communication. In fact, once they pick up on it, a number of studies have shown that they kind of overuse it during this particular stage. And not only are they using those particular terms, but they're also making up words. They're also finding ways to communicate that most people don't understand unless you're in that particular group. And these language skills are really, if we're studying it from a language perspective, something that's exceptional, something that's amazing. But if you're trying to communicate with these individuals, you might be able to appreciate how frustrating it is that these particular language skills have actually developed. Fortunately for us, most of us move past adolescence. We drop a lot of those dialectical skills. We drop a lot of the satire, and we focus more on just increasing our vocabulary, increasing our syntax, increasing our pragmatics into adulthood. And what we see with adults is that even though our writing skills still suffer, a large proportion of the population typically has fairly good language skills or vocabulary within oral language skills when they're trying to communicate with each other. But when we look at other types of language skills, written, reading, what we see is that there's a dramatic difference from individual to individual. And most of those differences typically can be predicted by looking at people's education levels, so the number of years of school that they've had, and the grades that they have in school, and their experience. So how much exposure they've had to people who are educated or who use language on a regular basis. And when we look at those differences and we can predict those, we not only can see where people's language skills are currently at when they're in their early adulthood ages, but we can usually predict with fairly good certainty exactly where their language skills are going to be when they reach late adulthood. And that's because once our language is set in early adulthood, usually even though all of us are learning a little bit more, picking up on a few more words or a few more ways to say things, our language stays fairly stagnant for the rest of our lives. And that is kind of a cause for concern for a lot of language specialists, but it's also kind of a cause for solace for a lot of people because we know we don't lose our language skills either. They're just fairly set once we reach adulthood. This idea of aging in language, though, is something we've kind of looked at before, and we're going to look at again. And it's this recognition that, yes, we don't, as we said earlier, lose a lot of language. In fact, a lot of times our language skills are increasing, but our ability to actually communicate sometimes does decline. And we believe that a lot of this is due to memory, in particular, kind of a lack of synapse connections, or a lack of connections between the neurons that are responsible for us producing specific words. And a lot of times, researchers argue that this memory-related problem can be identified when we see something called the tip of the tongue phenomenon, when people have a word that they're trying to use, but can't come up with it, can't find a way to actually use it. And this seems to be something that becomes more and more prevalent as we age. And when we look at people in our 60s and beyond, what we often see is that this tip of the tongue phenomenon occurs more and more often with these individuals as they age. And there's the belief that it really is an indication that memory is the problem with language skills, not that memory just naturally goes away as we age. But what we also see is that not only do we lose our ability to speak and communicate with people or even write to other people, but we also lose our ability to kind of follow language as well. But a lot of researchers believe that this is also something that's caused not by a decrement in language skills over age, but a decrement in other physical attributes as we age. In particular, a loss of our hearing abilities. Remember that curve we talked about earlier where people can't hear things as they get older in the very high and low ends of the frequency spectrum. So, young children are almost impossible to hear for the elderly, and people that speak very low are very difficult to hear for the elderly, which might explain some language abilities or listening language abilities, or listening language ability declines in the elderly. And the other thing that also could possibly be related to it is this reaction time loss that these people suffer from. So they might be able to follow the words that are being spoken, but they can't keep up with the pace of the word presentation. And that causes them to just completely lose what's being said. And we think, once again, that this physical change might actually be what's causing those decrements in conversation following skills the elderly have. Now, this means, though, that most of our language skills are fairly well maintained. There's only a few exceptions to this, and most of them are neurological in nature. In fact, one of the classic causes to language decrease that we often see with individuals, in fact, we use it very often as an indicator of this particular neurological disorder, is Alzheimer's disease. And when people dramatically lose language skills, Alzheimer's disease, that degeneration of the brain that we talked about earlier, is usually the cause to that particular problem. So when we look at language, we expect to see a small, subtle decrease in language skills, but nothing dramatic. And if it's there, just like kind of detecting a lack of gaze following is important in cognitive development and autism, well, that ability, or I guess that inability to keep up language skills is sometimes used as an indicator of Alzheimer's. Well, that marks pretty much the end of today's class. But what I thought we'd do before we finished here is kind of ask somewhat hypothetical / silly question and answer it in a way that kind of gives us more of a sense of why language is so interesting to psychologists. The question I thought we'd ask is, are humans the only species that communicate in a way that we would identify as language? Well, if you think about other species, monkeys, birds, fish, whales, the number of other species that might find ways to communicate, we should quickly recognize that language is something that's not just meant for humans. But when we look at these other species, what we also can see is that language isn't something that's nearly as complex in these species as it is for humans. And most researchers believe, at least most of the normal researchers believe, that this isn't just something that's the product of kind of experience. So, it's not like every animal in the world's just similar to the wild boy or genie that we talked about earlier. It's because human beings not only have language skills, but they're probably primed to speak language in ways that's much more complex than other species. And when researchers try to figure out what's causing this complexity, we've come up with a number of different explanations for it. One of the explanations that we have for why we're so complex in our speech processes, or we're so adept at being able to communicate, is that our brains seem to be almost hardwired to pick up on language. In fact, what a number of studies have shown is that we actually have specific regions of our brain called Broca's area, Wernicke's area, and there's actually a number of other areas not pictured here that connect those two areas and go a little bit above Wernicke's area that are actually conditioned for language. Essentially, if we don't have these areas, we lose almost all of our language skills. But because we have these areas, we're primed to be able to listen to things, to plan how we're going to communicate an idea, to actually be able to move our mouth to communicate the idea, and coordinate our voice and movement to actually take that idea that we have and bring it into a vocal form of communication. And if we look closer at these areas and all the complexities within them, we can really appreciate how human beings in particular have almost a biological priming to not automatically be able to speak and communicate, but to be kind of inclined to be able to understand spoken and written language. Another thing that we have going for us as human beings that allows us to understand things much better is that we have a couple cognitive tendencies that really help us master language at a young age. In particular, one of the big ones that we talked about in this class and last class are those joint attention skills that children develop. If we can understand what somebody's meaning, what somebody's focusing on, then life gets a lot simpler. We can pick up on words, we can pick up on meaning, we can pick up on all of the rules of communication very easily if we understand somebody's intention. So if we understand other person's perspectives and we have the ability to focus on them and what they're trying to communicate to us, we dramatically increase our vocabulary in a very, very short period of time. And what makes this even easier for us as children is the fact that human beings tend to not only be innately built to learn specific things, but they also seem to be innately built to teach in very specific ways. So we talked about this idea of scaffolding 3 classes ago when we discussed Lev Vygotsky and his theories of how children should be taught to learn basic cognitive skills. Now, scaffolding is something that Vygotsky first proposed for all cognitive processes, but what he argued was that some scaffolding we do is actually natural. In fact, one of the classic things that we do when trying to teach kids this concept of language is something called baby tone. Now, most of you might have no idea what I'm talking about, but if you've ever been around parents, baby tone is something that's very recognizable. So when you see a parent or a person talking to a child, just to think about what they do. Most of you probably are cringing right now because you can think of that high-pitched sound that they emit, and you can think about how slow they talk and how they accentuate all their vowels. That approach, that technique of communication, is actually kind of a natural, almost habit that we form in order to help young infants and children pick up on vocabulary. Because if we raise our voice, we raise our tone, kids can be attuned to the sounds that are important. They can recognize them a little bit easier. And if we delay our speaking and really focus in on the vowels, we also have the ability to pick up on where those pauses are supposed to be, where the words split. So when we talk to adults or when kids age and there's this kind of rapid succession of words, we already have a sense of where the pauses are supposed to be, even if they don't really emerge anymore. And that's why young children can pick up even easier than us another language, because they're kind of spoken to in a way that really facilitates this learning of language that they're already primed to do. So when we look at language skills, just kind of in closing, I don't want you to think that human beings are the only species that uses language. but we definitely have a lot of things going for us when we look at the complexity of our specific languages.
Alright, this marks the end of this material and the end of our cognitive section, actually. In our next couple classes, we're going to be moving into a new area of development called socio-emotional development. We'll kind of review that general idea of the different types of development in that slide, or in the next class, and then we'll get into some really interesting details about how we develop in our social world. So please, if you can, make sure that you review this material and get started on the next material so you can be well prepared as we start kind of turning the corner here near the end of the semester. Thank you very much for your time, and I will speak to all of you soon in our next class.